Dark Roast Caffeine Case Files respectfully acknowledges that we are on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We honor the Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people who have been stolen or silenced, and we commit to telling their stories with truth and respect. Hey case filers, welcome back, or if you're new, welcome to Dark Roast Caffeine Case Files. I'm your host, Kate. Today we are going somewhere that made me pour an entire pot of coffee before I could even start writing. Between March and May 2022, 4 Indigenous women disappeared from the streets of Winnipeg. They were mothers, daughters, grandmothers. Women who had survived homelessness, addiction, and a colonial system that never wanted them to thrive. One by one, they were lured to an apartment in the North Kildonan neighborhood, drugged, assaulted, murdered, and dismembered. The remains were stuffed into garbage bins and dumped at landfills across the city. The man who killed them was Jeremy Skibicki, a self-avowed white supremacist who later admitted that he targeted Indigenous women because he believed their lives didn't matter. Rebecca Contoy, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Moran, and a 4th woman who, for years, was known only as Buffalo Woman until her parents finally gave her back her name, Ashley Shingoose. 4 women, 2 months. One killer who thought he could get away with it because no one would care about a few dead Indigenous women. He was almost right. The first victim's remains were found quickly, but the other 3? They were lost in the chaos of Winnipeg's waste management system. Their families spent years fighting the government, the police, and a legal system that initially refused to search a landfill for their daughters' bodies. This is the story of a serial killer who embodied everything wrong with Canada's treatment of Indigenous women, and a daughter who refused to let her mother be forgotten in the trash. Before we go any further, a quick content warning. This episode contains descriptions of extreme violence, SA, dismemberment, and discussions of necrophilia. It also contains graphic accounts of racial hatred and the kind of systemic neglect that led 4 women to be murdered by a man who thought their lives were worthless. Listener discretion is advised. If you need to skip this episode, you can always come back to the next one. Also, I need to say this up front. This case does not have a clean ending. Yes, Skibicki was convicted and sentenced to life, but 3 of his victims were lost in a landfill for nearly 3 years. One of them, Ashley Shingoose, has never been found at all. The families are still grieving, the landfills are still being searched, and the question that haunts this case is the same one that has haunted every MMIWG tragedy. Would this have happened if they weren't Indigenous? So pour your coffee, settle in. To understand these murders, you have to understand the man who committed them. Jeremy Anthony Michael Skibicki was 35 years old in 2022. By all outward appearances, he was unremarkable. He lived in a modest apartment building at 360 Furby Street in Winnipeg's North Kildonan neighborhood, a working-class area of old houses, corner stores, and chain-link fences. Neighbors described him as quiet, kept to himself, the kind of guy you wouldn't notice if you passed him on the street. But behind that unremarkable facade was something monstrous. Skibicki was a white supremacist. During his trial, evidence emerged that he had been active in online forums dedicated to racial hatred. He had attended far-right rallies. He spoke openly about his belief that white people were being replaced by immigrants and Indigenous people. A conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement, and he had a special hatred for Indigenous women, whom he viewed as subhuman. The Crown's case would later reveal that Skibicki had stalked homeless shelters in Winnipeg, looking for victims. He specifically targeted Indigenous women because he believed that no one would come looking for them, that their disappearances wouldn't make the news, that their families wouldn't fight. He was wrong about that last part, but he wasn't entirely wrong about the rest. Winnipeg has a dark distinction. It is the MMIWG capital of Canada. Indigenous women make up a disproportionately high percentage of the city's missing and murdered population. In 2021 alone, the Winnipeg Police Service reported that Indigenous women accounted for over 60% of all female homicide victims in the city, despite making up only 12% of the population. Homelessness is rampant. Addiction is a crisis. And predators know exactly where to find their prey. Skibicki targeted women's shelters and drop-in centers. He would approach women who were desperate, hungry, homeless, struggling with addiction, and offer them food, alcohol, drugs, or just a safe place to sleep. Then he would bring them back to his apartment at 360 Furby Street. Once inside, he would drug them. The Crown's expert toxicologists later confirmed that Skibicki used a combination of sedatives, enough to render his victims unconscious and completely vulnerable. Then he would assault them, then he would murder them, then he would dismember their bodies. The details are too gruesome to fully describe here, but the trial heard evidence that Skibicki used power tools, saws, grinders to cut his victims into pieces small enough to fit inside garbage bags. He stored some of the remains in his apartment for days. Others he immediately disposed of in bins behind his building. Then he went back to the shelters and looked for his next victim. Rebecca Contoy was 24 years old. She was a member of Crane River First Nation, a community on the shores of Lake Manitoba. She was a mother. She had a daughter, aged just 2 at the time of her death, who was left behind to grow up without her mother. Those who knew Rebecca described her as someone who always had a heart for everything. She was bright, talkative, and had a good sense of humor. She loved to laugh. She loved her family, but like so many Indigenous women, she had been failed by a system that offered little support and fewer exits. She had struggled with homelessness, she had used drugs, and she had ended up at a women's shelter in Winnipeg, exactly where a predator like Jeremy Skibicki was waiting to find her. Rebecca Contoy was killed on or about May 15, 2022. Her partial remains were discovered 5 days later, on May 19, 2022, in a garbage bin behind an apartment building on Langside Street in Winnipeg. The discovery was described by police as a horrifically grisly homicide. She was the first of 4, and her death was the only one that finally cracked the case open. But by then, 3 other women were already dead. Morgan Harris was 39 years old. She was a member of Long Plain First Nation, about 100 kilometers west of Winnipeg. And she was the mother of 5 children and a grandmother of 1. Her eldest daughter, Cambria Harris, described her as feisty and fun. A woman who, despite struggling deeply in the last 15 years of her life with addiction and homelessness, was never anything less than loving to her children. Quote, "She was a mom of 5, Cambria said. She was a sister, she was a daughter, she was a grandmother. She was so much more than what had happened to her." End quote. Morgan Harris had been living in and out of shelters in Winnipeg. She was trying to get clean. She was trying to reconnect with her children. She was trying to survive. And on or about May 1st, 2022, she was lured to Skibicki's apartment on Furby Street. She never walked out. Cambria Harris didn't learn about her mother's death until December 1st, 2022, 7 months after she was killed. That was the day the police charged Skibicki with her murder. Before that, Cambria had been searching for her mother, calling shelters, posting on social media, begging anyone who might know something to come forward. But the police hadn't taken her seriously. They told her to wait, that her mother was probably just on a bender, that she'd come back when she was ready. It was the same story that Matilda Wilson heard in 1994. The same story that Indigenous families have been hearing for generations. And it was devastating. Mercedes Moran was 26 years old. She was also a member of Long Plain First Nation, and she was by all accounts a joy. Her grandmother remembered her as happy, smiley, and trusting. Her family remembers her as a bit of a practical joker, someone who would hide your purse or your shoes so you couldn't leave when it was time to go home. Quote, "I always remember her playing jokes," a relative said. "She'd always hide my purse or my shoes so I couldn't leave when it was time for me to go. I'd be looking all over for my stuff, and she'd just be laughing." End quote. Mercedes was also a mother. She had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who were left behind when she disappeared in May 2022. According to the Crown's case, Mercedes Moran was killed on or about May 4th, 2022. Just 3 days after Morgan Harris. Her remains were never found that year. They would spend nearly 3 years buried in the Prairie Green landfill, 16 kilometers north of Winnipeg, until a historic search finally brought them home. The fourth victim had no name for 3 years. She was Indigenous. She was in her mid-20s. And she had been killed on or about March 15th, 2022, making her Skibicki's first victim. But because her body was never found, because she had no identification on her when she disappeared, because no one had reported her missing, or no one had been taken seriously, she remained a ghost. She was known for years only as Buffalo Woman. The name was given to her by Indigenous elders and community members who refused to let her be forgotten. A pipe ceremony was held in her honor. Her spirit was called home, but her body was still somewhere in a landfill, and her real name was still a mystery. On March 26, 2025, 3 years after her death, DNA evidence finally identified her. She was Ashley Christine Shingoose, 30 years old, of St. Teresa Point, a remote First Nations community in northern Manitoba. Ashley Shingoose was a mother. She had family who loved her. She had been failed by every single system that was supposed to protect her. And her killer, a white supremacist who had targeted her because of her race, had tried to erase her entirely by throwing her body in the trash. But her parents refused to let her be erased. Even after her identification, they chose to keep her spirit name alive. Ashley Shingoose would continue to be known as the Buffalo Woman, a reminder that naming is an act of love, and that no one gets to disappear without a trace if we refuse to let them go. Let's lay out the timeline. It's short, it's brutal, and it tells you everything you need to know about how methodically this killer operated. March 15th, 2022. Skibicki kills his first victim, Ashley Shingoose, the woman who would become known as Buffalo Woman. Her body is disposed of in a garbage bin behind a strip mall on Main Street in Winnipeg. The garbage is collected and taken to a landfill. Her remains are never recovered. May 1st, 2022. Morgan Harris, mother of 5, is killed. Skibicki dumps her remains in a garbage bin outside his apartment building at 360 Furby Street. The bin is emptied 2 days later. Her remains end up at the Prairie Green landfill, 16 kilometers north of Winnipeg. May 4th, 2022. Mercedes Moran, mother of 2, is killed. Skibicki again uses the garbage bin at Furby Street. Her remains also end up at Prairie Green. May 15th, 2022. Rebecca Contoy, mother of a 2-year-old daughter, is killed. This time, Skibicki disposes of her remains in multiple locations. Some in the bin at Furby Street, some in a bin behind an apartment building on Langside Street in downtown Winnipeg. 5 days later, on May 19th, 2022, someone calls the police about a terrible smell coming from the Langside Street bin. Officers arrive and find a human leg. Then more remains. The investigation begins. When Rebecca Contoy's remains were found on May 19th, police initially thought they were dealing with a single isolated homicide. But as they began to investigate, a pattern emerged. Surveillance footage from Skibicki's apartment building showed him repeatedly pushing garbage bins to the curb at odd hours, and on days when garbage pickup wasn't scheduled. Witnesses came forward describing a man who had been seen near homeless shelters, offering rides to Indigenous women. And then, on May 20th, 2022, just one day after Rebecca's remains were found, Skibicki was arrested for an unrelated domestic assault. That arrest gave police time to dig deeper. By November 2022, investigators had linked Skibicki to the deaths of 3 more Indigenous women. They had DNA evidence. They had surveillance footage. And they had Skibicki's own words. Because after his arrest, he had made statements that were later admitted as evidence. On December 1st, 2022, 7 months after Rebecca Contoy's death, police formally charged Jeremy Skibicki with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The trial began in April 2024 and lasted 6 weeks. It was held before a judge alone, no jury. Because of the publicity and the complexity of the case, Chief Justice Glenn Joyal presided. Skibicki admitted to the killings. His defense was not that he was innocent, but that he was not criminally responsible due to mental illness. He claimed that he had suffered from schizophrenia, that he had been hearing voices, that he didn't understand what he was doing was wrong. The Crown disagreed. They argued that Skibicki's actions were calculated, planned, and driven by racial hatred. They pointed to his white supremacist online activity, his statements about targeting Indigenous women, and the meticulous way he had disposed of the bodies. This wasn't the work of a man who didn't know right from wrong. This was the work of a predator who knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care. On July 11th, 2024, Chief Justice Joyal delivered his verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. In his ruling, he dismissed Skibicki's claim of mental illness as fabricated and said the Crown had proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Skibicki understood his actions were both legally and morally wrong. Sentencing followed on August 28, 2024. Skibicki received 4 concurrent life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. The conviction was a victory, but for the families, it was hollow. Morgan Harris, Mercedes Moran, and Ashley Shingoose had never been found. The remains, or what remained of them, were somewhere in a landfill north of Winnipeg, buried under tons of garbage, crushed by machinery, inaccessible to anyone who wanted to give them a proper burial. Cambria Harris, Morgan's daughter, refused to accept that. Quote, "We are not trash," she said. Those 3 words became her rallying cry. She stood in front of cameras, spoke at press conferences, and demanded that the government search the Prairie Green landfill for her mother's remains. Quote, "Losing my mom to a serial killer was heartbreaking enough," she said. "But to know she wouldn't get a proper goodbye was even harder." End quote. The Manitoba government initially refused. The search, they said, would be too dangerous, too expensive, too logistically complex. There were environmental concerns. There were safety concerns for workers. And no, they didn't say it aloud. There was an unspoken calculus at play. The bodies of 3 Indigenous women were not worth the cost of a landfill search. Cambria and other family members spent years fighting. They staged protests. They met with politicians. They took their fight to the United Nations. And slowly, public pressure began to build. In December 2024, 2.5 years after Morgan Harris was murdered, the Manitoba government finally announced it would conduct a humanitarian search and recovery mission at the Prairie Green landfill. The search began in earnest in December 2024. It was the largest landfill recovery effort in Canadian history, possibly in North American history. Crews sifted through 50,000 tons of garbage. They wore hazmat suits, respirators, and full-body protective gear. They worked in freezing temperatures, knee-deep in snow and frozen waste. They used backhoes, excavators, and hand tools, sometimes digging through piles of refuse with nothing more than their gloved hands. On March 7, 2025, nearly 3 years after her death, the first set of remains was identified. They belonged to Morgan Harris. Cambria Harris wept. Quote, "My mom is finally home," she told reporters. "It shouldn't have taken 3 years, but she's home." 10 days later, on March 17, 2025, the second set of remains was identified. They belonged to Mercedes Moran. The search for Ashley Shingoose, Buffalo woman, continues. Her body was disposed of at a different landfill on the other side of Winnipeg. The Manitoba government has committed to searching that site as well, but the logistics are even more complex. Her family is still waiting. This case is not an anomaly. This is not a one-off tragedy. It is a textbook example of everything the MMIWG National Inquiry found when it declared the violence against Indigenous women a genocide. Skibicki targeted Indigenous women because he believed, and the system had confirmed that, their disappearances would not be investigated vigorously. He targeted women who were homeless, who were struggling with addiction, who were the most vulnerable in our society. And he thought he could get away with it because no one would care. The police response to the disappearances was, by the family's accounts, slow and dismissive. Cambria Harris was told to wait. Morgan Harris's body spent 3 years in a landfill because the government initially said the search was too expensive. There was no rush to find an Indigenous mother of 5, because at some level, the system had already decided her life was worth less than the cost of a backhoe. This is what genocide looks like in Canada. Not gas chambers, but landfills. Not death camps, but the slow, bureaucratic refusal to care. Rebecca Contoy, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Moran, Ashley Shingoose. 4 names, 4 mothers. 4 women stolen by a man who hated them for their race. We say their names because no one else will. Cambria Harris didn't stop fighting when her mother's remains were found. She founded an outreach group called Morgan's Warriors, named after her mother, that works to support vulnerable Indigenous women in Winnipeg. She and other volunteers walk the streets, handing out food, blankets, and naloxone kits to women who are still at risk. They are trying to save the next Morgan Harris, the next Mercedes Moran, before another predator finds them. Quote, "I'm doing this because I don't want another family to go through what we went through," end quote. Cambria said, "We waited 3 years. We shouldn't have had to wait at all," end quote. The other families are still fighting. Rebecca Contoy's mother, Maureen, spoke at a vigil shortly after her daughter's death. "My heart is broken," she said. "I miss her. She was my daughter. She didn't deserve that." Mercedes Moran's family still struggles to process the loss of their practical joker, their beloved aunt, their mother of 2. Quote, "I always remember her playing jokes," one relative said. "She'd hide my purse or my shoes so I couldn't leave," end quote. And Ashley Shingoose's parents, who waited 3 years to learn their daughter's name, have decided that she will continue to be known as Buffalo Woman, a spirit name that cannot be erased, even if her body is never found. If this episode has moved you, if the stories of Rebecca, Morgan, Mercedes, and Ashley have made you angry or sad or determined, here's what you can do. First, learn more. Read the MMIWG National Inquiry's final report. It's online, it is free, and every Canadian should read it. Pay special attention to the calls for justice related to police response and landfill searches. Second, support Indigenous-led organizations, the Native Women's Association of Canada, the Moose Hide campaign, Morgan's Warriors Outreach Program in Winnipeg. These organizations are on the front lines, working to keep Indigenous women safe. Third, talk about this episode. Share the names of the Winnipeg 4. Ask yourself, what would have happened if Cambria Harris had not fought for 3 years? What if she had given up? Whose job is it, really, to ensure that murdered women are not left in landfills? The answers to those questions are uncomfortable. They require us to look at our own complicity in a system that values some lives more than others. But looking is the first step toward change. If you or someone you know has been affected by violence against Indigenous women, the Hope for Wellness Helpline is available 24/7 at 1-855-242-3310. It offers immediate crisis intervention for Indigenous people across Canada. This episode is dedicated to the memory of Rebecca Contoy, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Moran, and Ashley Shingoose, and to Cambria Harris, who refused to let her mother be forgotten in the trash. Thank you for listening. Pour one out for the Winnipeg Four. Next week's episode will be episode 4 of my Canadian Indigenous History Month series. As always, please take care of yourself after listening to this episode. Do something grounding, call a friend, pet a dog. Sit in the sunlight. The darkness in these stories is real, but so is the light in the world. Don't forget to find it. Please follow, like, share, and subscribe to Dark Roast Caffeine Case Files. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and all of your favorite podcast streaming services. Stay tuned for more coffee and more crime. Bye now.